patience, everyone. So this is Ben Hohen, and I'm joined today by Joe Rand. We're both researchers at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group. So as you probably know, all participants are muted during the webinar, though we want to hear from you. So please submit questions via the chat window, and they'll be monitored throughout the presentation. If there are technical issues, hopefully they can be resolved during that time. And of course, if they're focused on the content, we'll have to get to them at the end of the presentation today. As you know, this webinar is being recorded. That recording will be up on the website as well, this PowerPoint that you'll see today, so you'll be able to look at it in more detail. There is a lot of content to cover today, and I will be going through fairly quickly. Hopefully you'll get a good feeling for the research and then be able to circle back if you need to with either contacting us or looking at the PowerPoint online or both. So this is the agenda for today. We are going to give you a background of this project. Actually, let me go back one slide here. This is the webinar 1 of the National Survey of Attitudes of Wind Power Project Neighbors. And the focus today is on the overall analysis of attitudes of the other neighbors. There'll be additional webinars, which we'll talk about today on a number of occasions, and I hope you're able to tune into those as well. As you can see from the slide, these are preliminary results, and I will talk to you more about what that means and what to take away from that meaning given what you'll see today. All right, so I'm going to give you a background on the project, and Joe's going to help me out for a portion of that. And then we're going to talk about the survey frame, the survey instruments and the responses and where they came from, that sort of thing, so you have a feel for the data that we analyzed. And then I'm going to focus on the analysis of attitudes results and give you obviously a lot more detail as to what that means and what that focus is on. And then I'll round it out with talking about next steps and outreach of the project. So let's talk about the background. This project is a collaboration of researchers from universities and national labs and the private sector. I've been really lucky to have the chance to work with all these exceptional individuals that are shown here on the slide. You'll hear more from each one of them or groups of them as if you listen in to the future webinars, because what we did is we divided up a lot of the work to focus in on where subject matter experts existed. So hopefully you'll be able to do that. This work is entirely funded by the Wind Energy Technologies Office of the Department of Energy, and we, of course, thank them very much for their support. So why conduct a survey of wind project neighbors? Well, the cumulative number of homes near turbines is increasing. That's shown in the figure on the left. As of 2015, we had a little less than 1.4 million homes within 5 miles of U.S. wind installations. Obviously, that number has grown as we've seen more deployment in 2016 and 2017. Interestingly, so too has another trend occurred, which is that the distance to the nearest homes is decreasing. Now, this isn't a dramatic decrease. This curve actually could be equally depicted as being fairly flat. What we aren't seeing is that the curve is moving away from homes. So we've got a growing number of homes closer to turbines and potentially turbines getting closer to those homes. And therefore, it's incredibly important to understand these communities that are impacted by these deployments. They could be impacted both positively and negatively by these deployments, and so we want to understand that. There's never been an effort to collect data across a broad set of these communities across the country, and so this project seeks to do that. More to the point, this project seeks to be first of its kind, broad-based representative sample of those communities living in close proximity to our U.S. turbines. We hope that the work will have applicability to a wide array of stakeholders to allow them to better understand the attitudes and annoyances and various aspects of living close to turbines. We hope that the work will allow greater confidence in the likely effects of proposed turbines by increasing the knowledge about the existing projects. And we also hope that this work will potentially inform wind stakeholder and DOE R&D priorities as they look to transition through the next generation of wind technologies and deployments that will come after us. So the work followed a basic structure that's very common for research. We conducted a literature review at the beginning, and Joe will talk about that after this slide. And then we collected data and analyzed those data, and that's sort of where we are right now. We're just rounding out the analysis and preparing the deliverables and conducting some of the outreach today. So Joe's going to give you a quick overview of the literature review that he led. It's a great piece of research. You should look it up yourself. It's available on our website. And with that, I'll hand it over to Joe and wait for him to hand it back to me after a few slides. Joe.
Thanks, Ben. So yeah, as Ben alluded, we conducted a pretty extensive literature review and that preceded the data collection and analysis that will be summarized later in this presentation. And that full literature review was published in the journal Energy Research and Social Science, but it's also available for free download via the LBNL website. So if you want to dig in to more of these details, you can access it there. And we will also eventually be uploading a summary PowerPoint deck of that literature review to the LBNL website. So the purpose of this literature review effort was broadly to understand the state of the art of North American wind acceptance research, so what has been done, but also to identify and synthesize the major themes and correlates to acceptance that have been studied previously, and also really to just set the stage for our upcoming data collection and analysis through the survey research. So in that sense, to identify major knowledge and methodological gaps that our work could address. Next slide, please, Ben. So we began reviewing papers in late 2014 and continued collecting and reviewing all the research that came out basically through mid-2017. We did focus primarily on peer-reviewed literature, but also looked at some gray literature, and also focused primarily on North American wind energy projects, but we did review some of the European literature as well. So as you can tell, we discovered this wasn't exactly a new area of research. In fact, in some form or fashion, academic research in this topic has been going on for about 30 years. But as you can see from the figure, it's an area of growing interest and importance that's both globally and in North America. So this figure shows the year on the x-axis and the number of North American publications pertaining to wind energy acceptance on the y-axis. So in the end, we reviewed over 130 published reports and journal articles for this review. And then Ben, if you'll advance the slide again. Now, if we overlay a figure that Ben showed earlier, the number of homes within 5 miles of large turbines, and that's now shown in orange on the figure and correlating on the right axis here, we see a similar growth pattern over time. So this relationship might be just coincidental, but what is clear is that academic interest in the subject is ramping upward at the same time that more people are interacting with these developments. Next slide, please. So in the end of this review, we illuminated a number of important research gaps, again, both kind of methodological and gaps in the research itself and knowledge. So to summarize those, no study had previously surveyed a nationally representative sample of individuals living near turbines in the US. And moreover, relatively few individuals living within 1 mile of turbines had been surveyed previously. Acceptance of wind has rarely been compared to other energy sources like natural gas, coal, nuclear, or solar. Researchers have not distinguished between residents who moved into the area after wind farm construction from those who had been living there before construction. There had been little work done to correlate attitudes and modeled or measured sound levels at residences. Community preferences for the development process had not been really well understood. And preferences for community compensation around wind projects were also not well understood. And then thinking about property value impacts, there's been a good body of empirical research and statistical research about property value impacts, but the perception of those impacts by local community members and how those perceptions influence attitudes toward their local wind project remains pretty fuzzy. And then relatively few longitudinal studies or studies over time had been conducted to examine how attitudes might change over time. And finally, researchers have not really studied the actual implementation of development models or frameworks or recommended practices that have been derived from the wind acceptance literature. Next slide, please, Ben. So in the end, after identifying these gaps, the research that Ben is highlighting that was led by LBNL was able to address all but the final 2 gaps on this slide. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Ben to introduce that work.
Thanks, Joe. All right, so I'm going to talk about the survey frame that was used. And this was the next step after identifying all these research gaps. We developed the survey instrument that would seek to fill those gaps. So let's talk about the data collection effort that occurred. It was a multimodal survey, which meant that it was data collected in multiple ways. In this case, it was phone, internet, and mail. We collected data at the end of 2015 through the middle of 2016. And the survey itself was 22 minutes long and about 50 questions or so. The survey instrument will also be available in due time. And this isn't a great time to collect data, we found out. This was also the election year. So despite people being inundated with phone calls and interest in being surveyed, we still ended up with a very good response rate for this type of survey. We ended up with 1,705 valid responses that we will analyze, and we'll talk about those today. So those responses were collected near 250 wind power projects across 24 states from the full sample of 743 what we consider modern wind projects. And by modern wind projects, we mean projects with turbines greater than or equal to 364 feet tall, and turbines with a capacity greater than or equal to 1.5 megawatts. We wanted to do this because we wanted to make sure we had a representative sample of what turbines will be in the future and are currently in our data set. And so that's why we limited it to those larger turbines. Now those responses, the projects from which we drew sample are shown on the map in green circles. There are also, you'll see red stars. Those are sites where we modeled sound to compare that to responses from our survey. We'll be talking about that in, I think, it's a third webinar led by RSG, the folks from RSG. And then you should also note in terms of methodological approach for the sampling, we oversampled in a number of different areas. First, we wanted to make sure we captured responses from those close to the turbines. And if you just randomly sample around wind facilities, you'll tend to get individuals that are much further away because that's where most people live. We wanted to make sure we got those that were very close, so we oversampled there. We also oversampled near large projects for the same reason. Large projects tend to be in rural areas where there's not as much population. Otherwise, you get lots of people from very densely populated areas where there are smaller projects. Finally, we oversampled at those 15 locations where we modeled the sound. So here is an array of sample based on the distance that the home is from the nearest turbine. As you can see, most of the respondents are very close to the turbine, 621, and much fewer are further away, 264, for instance, between 3 and 5 miles. Well, this is exactly opposite the way that the population itself is arrayed. So this was a choice we made because we wanted to make sure we got the responses from people close, but we need to adjust the sample if we're going to have it be representative of the population. So to do that, we weight the sample, and we do this not only to adjust for the sampling choices we made that I just described, but also because our sample is going to be a little different than the underlying population in terms of demographics. So we looked at the difference in gender and education and income, and we adjusted our sample based on those characteristics so that it portrayed the underlying population, and therefore what you'll be seeing today are results representative of that population. So I mentioned that there are a variety of analysis areas that will be covered in the upcoming webinars. Today we're covering the overall analysis of attitudes work, but there were 3 other specific topic areas that I thought I'd just tell you about, and we won't be covering those today. The first is a focus on the planning process, fairness, and attitudes. That will be the subject of the second webinar. Then there was, as we mentioned, a discussion, an analysis of predicting audibility and annoyance to wind project sounds using the modeled sound level. That will be the subject of the third webinar. And finally, our colleagues from Germany focused in on those individuals that responded to our survey that were strongly annoyed. And by strongly annoyed, we mean people that were highly annoyed and also had symptoms that they attributed to that emission source, whether that would be sound or visual aspects. So they looked at those individuals. They'll be talking about them in the fourth webinar. And they also compared our results to the results they had already collected in a number of different European countries. So that's really interesting. I look forward. I hope that you can join us for those webinars. So let's go back to the work that we wanted to cover today, the overall analysis of attitudes. The purpose of this work was to investigate attitudes and the underlying influences across all respondents, including those that moved in either pre or post-construction. As Joe mentioned, this is an area that we thought would be particularly interesting to look at, and so we'll be talking about that today. I mentioned that this work is these results are preliminary. That means we have not submitted it to a peer-reviewed journal for review. And so it could be during that process the results changed. The reviewers ask us to do other things, and because of that, we might have some conclusions that change. So we recognize that that's the case, and we hope you do too. And if you do want to use this work, please make sure you cite it appropriately as preliminary results from this webinar. All right, so let's talk about some of the results. I'm going to first go over some bi- and trivariate correlations just to have you have a sense of the attitudes and how they change based on one or two maybe particular factors. And then we'll go over quickly the multivariate regression, which combines all these factors so that we can understand which are the strongest influencers to attitude. So we asked everybody in our survey, what is your attitude toward the local wind project now? And they had the choices of very negative, negative, neutral, positive, or very positive to respond to. Of course, they could also just choose not to answer the question. And as you can see, more than half of the individuals were positive or very positive toward their local wind project. Roughly a third were neutral. And the remainder, about 8%, were negative or very negative toward the local wind project. So this gives you a sense as to the distribution across the entire set of data. And of course, we're going to see different distributions of this same question as we explore them based on a variety of other covariates. But before I do that, I wanted to briefly point out a few things on this figure that you'll keep seeing over and over again. So on the top right is mean attitude. The attitude question was, let's see if I can circle that. The attitude question was had 5 different responses. You could be very negative with a value of -2, negative with a value of -1, neutral with 0, positive with 1, or very positive with 2. And so a mean attitude of 0.71 is sort of most of the way to positive, but between neutral and positive. That just gives you a quick way to look at where that mean is. And when you're comparing two sort of cohorts, you can quickly look at the mean attitude to see how different they are. But of course, the mean can be influenced by the distribution, and we'll see this in a few slides. And so we also talk about how different the distributions are. The other thing to note on this slide is the n. In every case, we have the n that we talk about in the various slides, and you can see that here above the figure. All right, let's see if we can get them off and move the slides. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the differences across respondents, and we're going to be looking at a variety of different categories of differences. One is looking at differences depending on the wind project characteristics that individual lives near. Second would be differences by compensation, whether they're compensated or not. Third is differences of sensory perceptions or planning process perceptions, or various attitudes they might have towards other things that could influence their attitude toward the project. And then finally, demographics we'll talk about. So let's dig into it. The first is the wind project characteristics. We obviously know where these individuals live. So how are the attitudes different for those that live close to the turbines, for instance, within a half mile, different from those that are further away? In this case, we see that those that were within a half mile are both more positive and more negative than those individuals much further away, which is another way of saying they're less neutral. And that's not surprising. People quite close to the turbines will have made up their mind. They will not be undecided about their opinion for the turbines, and so this isn't that big of a surprise. What's interesting to see is that the mean attitude is pretty similar between those that are close and those that are farther away. This allows me to point out some of the statistics on the bottom of the screen. There is an F statistic, which is a chi-squared statistic that talks about differences of those two distributions, and you would find a higher F if they were very different and a very low p-value. As well, I compare the means, and that's shown in the last statistic, the difference of means p-value. When we see a very low p-value there, we know that the means are pretty different. So you'll see those statistics as we move through these slides. What about differences by whether an individual was compensated? Those that were receiving compensation, we found, are similarly more negative and more positive than those individuals not receiving compensation. Again, less neutral, no surprise. They've made up their mind whether they like the wind facility or not, and those that are not receiving compensation have not. But let's dig a bit more into those that are being compensated and those that are close to the turbines. This figure shows those that are receiving compensation and are also within a half mile of the turbines, as compared to those that are not receiving compensation, but those that are also within a half mile. And what we can see is that when we compare these two cohorts, those that are receiving compensation are less negative and more positive than their folks, their neighbors, I guess, that are not receiving compensation but are living in the same area. And this difference is statistically significant. When we dig further into the question of compensation, which we are able to do because of some of the questions we asked, we find that there are some interesting differences. So we asked individuals whether they were receiving compensation. We also know whether they had turbines on their property. Therefore, we can get a sense as to whether they were hosting that turbine and are receiving compensation for it. We know that those that are hosting turbines received compensation at much higher levels than other folks. What we see here is those that are receiving compensation and do not have turbines on their property, much more negative and less positive than those individuals that are receiving compensation and do have turbines on their property. And we see a statistical difference there between those two cohorts. How about arrival into the area? That was one of the questions Joe pointed out early on we wanted to look at. In this case, we're breaking the group into those that moved in prior to construction as compared to those that moved in after construction. And we see that those that moved in prior to construction are a little more negative and a little less positive than those that moved in after construction, but the differences are not statistically significant. When we limited those to those that are when we take out the group that are being compensated, leaving only those that are not being compensated, we do see statistically significant differences. For instance, those that moved in prior to construction and are not compensated are much more negative and less positive than those that moved in after construction and are also not being compensated. No surprise there. Well, actually, this is one of the things that did surprise us, because what we see is that there seems to be some sorting that is going on in the community where individuals are self-selecting into the community, we believe, that are more positive toward the wind facility. Let's talk about sensory perceptions now. We asked individuals, can you see a wind turbine from any spot on your property? And we find that those that can see a turbine from their property are a little more negative and a little less positive than those individuals that cannot see, but that difference is not statistically significant. When we ask them, though, do you like the way the wind project looks, we do find dramatic differences. Those that do not like the way the wind project looks are much more negative toward their local wind project than those individuals that like the way the wind project looks. And this is a good time to point out the fact that in many of these questions, we don't know the causation. We don't know the direction of cause here. We know that there's correlation, but we don't know which is causing which. So, for instance, is it that an individual did not like the way the wind turbine looks and therefore has a more negative attitude about it, or vice versa, they had a negative attitude and therefore don't like the way the wind project looks? We don't know, but what we do know is that this is a very potent correlate with attitude, which is aesthetics of the wind facility. How about sound? We asked people, have you heard the sound from the wind project? And those that had heard the sound are more negative and less positive than those individuals that have not heard the turbines. Now we asked individuals, actually, can you hear the sounds from your property? And if you could hear the sounds, are you annoyed by those sounds? And that's what's showing on this slide. Those individuals that feel either somewhat, moderately, or very annoyed by the sounds of the wind project have a much more negative attitude and less positive attitude than those individuals that are not at all or slightly annoyed. Again, we aren't sure which way the causation goes here, but we know that there's very strong correlation. How about planning process fairness? This is an area of work that we thought we could do a good job of in understanding. And we asked individuals, to what extent did you believe the planning process was fair? And we found that those that believed the planning process was not at all or slightly fair are much more negative and less positive than those individuals that perceive the process as being moderately or very fair. Again, not sure of the direction of the causation here, but we clearly see that there's a correlation. Joe mentioned property value perceptions as one of the areas we wanted to cover from this work. And so we asked everyone, do you believe the wind project has affected the value of your property? And if it has, in what direction? Those that believe it affected their property and they believe their property value decreased are much more negative toward the wind project locally than those individuals that do not believe it affected their property or do believe it affected their property and increased the value. Now, there's more detail on this particular question in the supplemental slides. If we have time in Q&A and somebody's curious about it, I'd be glad to flip to that slide. But I'm not going to be able to go into more detail here. But it is an interesting area of our work to look at how property value impacts and the perceptions of those impacts vary across our sample set. Focused back now on attitudes, we asked individuals, how concerned are you about climate change? And we found individuals that responded not at all or slightly concerned are more negative toward their local project than those individuals that are somewhat moderately or very concerned by climate change. Now we asked them a follow-up question which gave us a bit more understanding of why individuals might have a negative or positive attitude about this and climate change. We asked them, do you consider wind energy to be an effective means of reducing climate change? And those that perceive wind as not being effective are much more negative and less positive towards the local wind project than those that believe it to be effective. And this is regardless of whether they have what their attitude is about climate change in and of itself. Another related attitude is a question about your attitude toward wind energy in general. We asked folks, in general, the development of the wind projects in the U.S. should be, and they had response choices of discouraged, allowed, encouraged, or no opinion. Those that believe wind energy development in the U.S. should be discouraged or no opinion, or had no opinion about it, had a much more negative attitude toward their local project. Vice versa, those that believe it should be allowed or even encouraged are much more positive toward their local wind project. Now, this is a test that we did intentionally to see whether there was a relationship between your opinions locally and your opinions more broadly. And we found that there is a very strong relationship to your opinions locally and your opinions more broadly. This means that there isn't a disconnect, at least in our data, and therefore does not support the idea that there is a not in my backyard effect within our data set. What about wind project characteristics? I talked previously about distance to the project, but what about the project itself? In this case, we're using a delineation of greater than 10 turbines to define a large project. And we found that those within short distances of large projects had more negative and less positive attitudes than those that were within close distances of small projects. And there was a statistical difference between those two. We also looked at other wind project characteristics, such as the year of the installation and the total turbine height, and I can talk about that when I get to the regression results. There are a number of demographic variables we looked at. I'm just going to slip through two here. We asked individuals what their education level and found that there really is no difference in attitude for those that had high school or less education versus those that had college or more education. We also asked individuals about their annual income And again, we don't find statistical differences between those that make more money or declare they make more money versus those that don't. We also looked across a variety of other demographic characteristics, whether the home was the primary or secondary residence, what their gender was, and their race and their age, and did not also find differences, at least based on these bivariate calculations. So that gets us to the end of that part and on to the multivariate regression. I'm cognizant of the time here. I want to make sure we have enough time, so I am moving a little fast, and I apologize for that in advance. So a multivariate regression allows us to kind of combine all those individual factors that we just looked at into one regression to see which ones come out as the most strong, as well allow us to control for certain aspects of one so that we can get the individual effect of another. And so in this case, we have those set of independent variables in our regression, and the dependent variable is the same one we've been talking about all day, attitudes toward the local wind project. In this case, the overall R-squared for the model is relatively high, 0.67. That's decent for social science research. We have a variance inflation factor, which looks at multicollinearity between our predictors, and we found that that is relatively low. I'm sure I'm boring everyone on the call here, but I thought I'd just quickly note that. And finally, you should note that this presentation shows linear regression results, but we also conducted analysis using ordered logit results with and without multiple imputation to fill in missing values. And for those of you that are aware, that's a good way to kind of test the robustness of the results. They were similar regardless of which way we went. So let's now talk about the regression results here. You'll see in this figure, using the brown text, the various areas of variables and factors that we wanted to look at: the planning process arrival, related attitudes, sensory perceptions, project characteristics, and demographics. On the figure, there are bar charts there, and some are colored green and some are colored gold. The ones that are colored green denote variables that are statistically significant, and those that are gold denote those that are not statistically significant, and therefore we aren't necessarily sure that the relationship between them and attitude is there by chance or not. Now, what this figure is actually showing is a change in the AIC, which is a way to sort of look whether this particular variable or variable set helps explain attitude changes. And so this is a quick way to look across the entire set of results to get a feel for what variables have the most influence in terms of defining or predicting attitude, in terms of their overall correlation between these variables and the changing of attitude. So what we can see, moving from the top to the bottom, is that planning process fairness and whether you moved in after construction or not are both strong predictors, but not as strong as some of the other factors in our model. For instance, related attitudes have a very strong influence, whether you're concerned about the climate change, wind's effectiveness at combating climate change. Even though I didn't talk about it, whether community is a strong part of your identity or not, your attitude toward the local wind project in general, and perceived property value effects. These are the ones that really dramatically are correlated with attitude and help explain changes in attitude in this model. As well, sensory perceptions are very important, such as the look of the turbines, how they fit within the landscape, and whether an individual is annoyed by the sounds of the turbines. Other than whether turbines are on your property or whether the individual is receiving compensation from the owner of those turbines, none of the project characteristics had strong relationships with the attitude. So it didn't matter whether the nearby turbines were installed a bunch of years ago or more recently. It didn't matter if the height were different across our sample for the turbines, whether the nearby project was large or small, and the distance, as we talked about, that the home is from the turbines. Similarly, we didn't find a relationship from the demographic characteristics and the attitude, as shown there on the bottom set in the figure. There are lots more information about these regressions in the supplemental slides, which I obviously didn't have time to go through today, but I hope you will have a chance to look at. So these are the conclusions that we can draw from this analysis, and I'm going to just read them because we want to make sure they're very clear in terms of what we think you can take away and what we cannot. A majority of respondents are positive, we found, including individuals very close to the turbines within a half mile, and those that are not compensated, but with a notable minority of those in our sample that hold concerns about the project and have negative attitudes. We found that perceptions of the planning process are strong predictors of attitude. We found also that being able to see and hear the turbines alone doesn't necessarily drive attitudes, but annoyance to those sounds and how well the turbines are perceived to fit within the landscape do. We found that compensation can positively influence attitudes, but differences do exist between those that host and do not host a turbine on their property. And even though we didn't talk about it today, there's a slide about preferences for compensation, and we found that community compensation is preferred by those that are uncompensated currently. And there is a supplemental slide on that, which I can cover if somebody's interested in the Q&A. We see that there's a strong relationship between attitudes of wind energy in general and attitudes locally. Talked about that. And we see that wind's perceived effectiveness in combating climate change affects attitudes as well. We found that the stronger one's attachment to the community, the more positive one's attitude is found to be. Now, we didn't talk about this individual result, but it was part of the regression results. We found that neither respondent demographics nor local wind project characteristics seem to be correlated with attitudes. We found that individuals arriving after construction are significantly more positive than those that were there before, especially when you control for compensation. And their attitudes are more strongly impacted by community attachment, sound annoyance, and if the home is the primary residence. These are conclusions that we can draw from the supplemental slides that we didn't have a chance to talk about today. We see that there's a lack of evidence of not in my backyard effect in our data. We see that a large majority of respondents, even those within a half mile and not being compensated, believe their property values have not been adversely impacted, but a minority do believe they've been impacted. That, again, is something shown in the supplemental slides. And finally, we find that living near a wind project is preferred over other large-scale energy plants, except solar, where it's about half and half. And those, again, are results that are shown in the supplementary slides. So what are the takeaways from this work for us as researchers? We think stakeholders seeking to improve attitudes might pay special attention to the planning process and its fairness, perceived aesthetics and sound annoyances, and how wind plays a role in combating climate change. We think compensation might be used to improve attitudes, but it has to be carefully used because it might also adversely affect them, especially for those not hosting turbines. As I mentioned from the last slide, community compensation might also be explored. And finally, we find that a majority of residents, even those close to proximity to the turbines, have positive attitudes. And it appears that over time, as people move in and out of the community, that might improve, as individuals might self-select into the community that have more positive attitudes toward the local project. All right, that gets us to the end of the presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm going to talk about some next steps briefly and then outreach and give ourselves about 15 minutes for Q&A. So, as I've mentioned on a number of occasions, there are a number of webinars upcoming, February 13th, 27th, and March 13th. We hope you will register for those. You can do so on our website, and I'll be showing that link on the next slide, but you can, I guess, now Google it too. We'll also be conducting a panel at the WIA Siting Compliance Conference, and a number of the researchers that are shown that will be giving the webinars will be there, so we can interface directly if you're going to be there. All of this work will ultimately be submitted for peer review and publication. Some has already been submitted. Joe's paper has, and as well Jeremy's paper, which would be the subject of the second webinar, has already been accepted, and it's available on our website as well. At the end, we'll release the data, and also the survey instrument once we're done with our analysis. Okay, so that gets us to questions. There are some links here on this page. Obviously, you don't have the hot link for these, but you can Google, I am told, National Survey of Attitudes of Wind Power Project Neighbors and get the website. That's where you can register for the webinars. Again, mention that these are preliminary results, so we ask that you cite them using the following citation shown there on the screen. And finally, we need to again thank the Department of Energy for supporting this work. So with that, good. We have 15 minutes or so. Joe and Kristen, are there any questions, or did I just put everybody to sleep?
We have a lot of great questions that came in. I tried to answer a handful of them via the chat, but there are a number that remain. So Ben, maybe I'll go through in the order that they were received for now, and let's see if we can get through all of them. So the first one, Ben, is did you ask how much compensation? So the amount of compensation, and did that influence attitudes?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did ask that. We asked a few questions about compensation. So for instance, we asked whether they received a lump sum payment or are receiving payment over time, or both. And then we also asked them the level of those payments, so the level of the lump sum payment and the level of the payments over time. So if one is to correlate those to attitudes, one needs to come up with sort of a present value of that stream of potential income, including the initial upfront payment if it existed. And that was right where we stopped doing the analysis. The question would be, are individuals that are receiving higher levels of compensation have more positive attitudes? And I can't answer that question, but hopefully we will by the time that this paper gets published, because that is something that I thought we could do as part of this. So sorry, we do have the answers, we just haven't analyzed them.
Great. So the next question, maybe similarly, can you say anything about variations in attitude toward wind in different parts of the country? The question asker is particularly interested in New England and New York.
Yeah, that's a great question too. Joe and I talked about this just last night. We have not analyzed our data based on states or regions or things like that. We obviously are looking for specific aspects of the area around a wind facility to tie to. So for instance, the size of the turbines, the age of the turbines, the proximity people are from those turbines. And we hope those are indicative of particular areas of the country, but obviously there is much heterogeneity across different areas, even in the same state. And so I guess we're a little cautious about analyzing data based on a particular state, let's say, or a region. We haven't done that. What we do hope to do, though, is look at the differences in topography, because maybe, for instance, attitudes are really different in areas where wind turbines are installed on ridgetops versus in more plains locales and flatter areas. And we think that would be a relatively unbiased way to look at the data and therefore see if there's a relationship there. And so that is something we hope to do as part of the wind modeling work, is develop the algorithm to differentiate different topographies based on, again, the underlying landforms.
Great. So the next question, can you compare what overall percentage feel that property values have changed, that there is sound disruption, and that there is visual disruption? So I think this is less about how does it correlate to attitudes, but what is sort of the overall kind of summary statistic percentage of those that feel that way? Do we have those in the additional slides?
Yeah, I don't have those. I'm going to move to the property value one. Oh, shoot. Sorry about that, everyone. Let's see if I can get this back. So I'm going to have to go through the presentation now. We know that the number of individuals, the percent of individuals that are annoyed by the turbines is relatively low. Joe, do you happen to know that off the top of your head? And I should say that we have a set of summary statistics that talk about a number of these things, and I don't have them handy because I'm sharing my screen, but I'm moving carefully through to not get past this last slide here. Okay, let's see here. This is the property value question. So we can see that overall, roughly half of, so this is broken out by distance, and what we can see is roughly half of those individuals within a half mile don't believe their property were affected. 6% believe it increased their value. 18% said it was affected, but they didn't know which direction. And the remainder, 25%, believe it decreased their value. Now, obviously, those percentages are much more lopsided as we move further away from the turbines. But I think this was pretty interesting to note that more than half don't believe their property values have been affected, and they live within only a half mile of the turbines. And if you include that yes but unknown direction and yes increased value, you can see that it's 3/4 of the respondents don't believe their property value was affected, but of course 25% do. And of course these are just perceptions. They don't necessarily know. And you should note that these are only respondents that are not receiving compensation. So it's important to note that these are individuals that might not be influenced by that aspect. And Joe, do you happen to know the answer to the other two?
Well, I just ran a quick statistic on the data we have, and in terms of annoyance to sound, when we look at the weighted data, and this includes those in the sample who cannot hear or who reported they had not heard sounds from turbines, but about 82% fall in the category of have not heard or are not at all annoyed. So I guess the remainder, or about 18%, may have experienced some level of annoyance from slightly to very. And then I could do the same for annoyance to landscape. It'll just take me a moment. So maybe we should get to the next question, and then we can return to it.
Yep, Joe, and why don't I point out that this question of annoyance is obviously something we focused a lot on. It's not something I focused a lot on, but it's the focus of the folks at RSG, which will be the third webinar, and also our German colleagues, and that will be the fourth webinar. So we have a lot more information about these levels of annoyance to various emission sources, whether it's sound or aesthetics or the lighting, in those webinars. And so, sorry I can't give you more details today. Obviously, if you just send us an email, we'll be able to give it to you. But it will be part of those upcoming webinars.
That's a good solution. So great, let's move on. The next question is, did we control for political views, i.e. Republican versus Democrat?
No, we did not.
Yep.
That would have been a good way to have people hang up last year, so we chose that. We did that intentionally.
Perfect. The next question, curious how the numbers you see here compare to research on community acceptance of other types of development, such as highways, shopping centers, schools, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can see Tom as the one that answered that, asked that. We don't have. I don't know the answer to that question. It's something that probably we should include in the paper, so I'm making note of it. But I will see if we can not lose the slides here. And this slide is the one I wanted to show you, which is we asked individuals, would you rather live near a wind project or a commercial scale solar project, natural gas plant, coal plant, or nuclear power plant? And these are respondents that I'm showing for this particular figure are only those that live within a half mile of their local wind project and that were there prior to construction. Because remember, we know that the people that moved in after were slightly more positive toward the wind project, and people maybe that were further away might have not a clear sense of their local wind project. So we wanted to make sure we controlled for that. So that's what this figure is showing, and as you can see, roughly half would want to live, about the same would want to live near a wind project as they would a commercial scale solar project. But other than that, we see that the large majority would rather live near another plant. Now, obviously, this is a very quick answer to a very complicated question, but this is some set of responses that we got. If this was an area that needed to be dug into a more comprehensive survey about what it's like to live near a natural gas plant, coal plant, or nuclear power plant would obviously need to be considered.
Yeah, and I'll note that we briefly touched on this in the literature review paper as well, that some level of resistance or opposition to any type of development is normal, and that's been true even for parks in a community. Or another funny example is the Statue of Liberty faced some opposition to erecting that. So indeed, it is normal, but we have not compared those explicitly. So let's move on to the next question. Someone is interested in seeing what we have about community compensation. So Ben, if you have those extra slides that touch on community compensation, maybe we could touch on that now.
Yep. Hi, Sarah. Thank you for joining us today. So this is, we asked individuals, regardless of how compensation was handled in your case, which of the following would you most prefer? And I wasn't exactly sure how to break this data up the best way, so I'd be glad to interact with you directly on this particular question. But just for today, I broke it up by those that were receiving compensation versus those that were not. And what we can see is that for those that were receiving compensation, they like that and they prefer that. They, more than half want to see that continue. But a significant minority, 18%, don't believe the community compensation is preferred, and actually, surprisingly, 22% didn't have an opinion on it. Of those that were not receiving compensation, we see sort of a split between individual level compensation, community level compensation, and compensation is not appropriate at all, surprisingly. And we didn't give folks an opportunity to pick multiple aspects for this. We asked them what they most prefer, but it might be that individuals believe that one or two are appropriate versus just one. So anyway, Sarah, that's an answer to your question. I'm glad to iterate more on this if you want to dig into this particular question.
Great. So let's see if we can get through a couple more in the remaining time. So this question is, did wind power developers consider compensating pre-construction neighbors as a means to soften their stance toward the project?
I mean, one would assume yes, because obviously the deal, an arrangement to compensate individuals is probably done prior to the development of the project. So those neighbors that are there in the pre-construction period are being talked to and arrangements are made. I guess it's theoretically possible that a neighbor that is nearby is approached after the project is put up, but I'm not familiar with that happening.
Yeah, and to be clear, I guess we did not have data, specifically about those contracts or those arrangements, but we did ask the individual respondents whether they were receiving compensation and what type. Okay, the next question says, interesting that we did not find evidence for NIMBY, or not in my backyard. So is it fair to say then that for those who are negative towards the projects, they're more of a not in anyone's backyard mentality?
Yeah, I mean, another way to think about it is that these individuals have strong reservations toward wind in general. And so they believe, for instance, maybe it doesn't, they believe it doesn't effectively combat climate change, for example, or that they would like to see other sources of energy utilized and not wind energy. And so, the backyard part is maybe what I'm having problems with. I think that the point that can be made with this research in general, and Joe spent a lot of time thinking about this for his paper, is that their concerns are not only theirs for their own area, but for other areas as well. And so they might have concerns about various things that don't necessarily involve their own backyard. Joe, do you want to add anything there?
No, I think that was a good answer. But yeah, definitely you can refer to the paper for more discussion of that too. Or yeah, certainly if you email us, we'd be happy to chat more about that as well. So let's see, maybe we have time for one or two more.
Yeah, actually, Joe, let me just stop briefly and tell folks just that I think Joe and I are both willing to stick around here if anybody wants to. The conference won't close down, so if there are a lot more questions I can see than we're going to be able to get to. So we'll maybe stick around and try to answer them if folks are around, and then we'll try to do our best to answer them via email because I think everybody's email is here. And so I wanted to give people an opportunity to depart gracefully, and thank you for your attention today. We're really excited about this work. It's been a tremendous effort and obviously involved a lot of people, and I'm so glad to be able to get it out there and start talking about it, and we'll look forward to doing so over the next bunch of webinars. I really encourage you to join. There'll be just very different looks at these data than we looked at today, and give you a much better feel for some aspects that I didn't have a chance to cover. So let's keep on answering questions, I guess. I don't know if we'll have to draw the line somewhere, Joe, but let's go maybe another 5 or 10 minutes.
Sure,
Okay,
sounds great. Absolutely. So there's a question here about the preference for community compensation, and it's whether this preference is, preferring community compensation over good neighbor payments, or community compensation over leaseholder payments, and or good neighbor payments. So it's kind of a question, is it a perceived winner and loser remedy? Ben, do you want to take a crack there?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We didn't get into that kind of detail. It would be great to do that. So what type of payments really matter? Obviously, individuals that don't host turbines will only be privy to either community payments or good neighbor payments. But should good neighbor payments, be encouraged? Should always there be community level compensation of some kind? Those are great points, and I think the literature has done a much better job than we have in kind of digging through some of those. I can't remember the name of the paper, Joe. Maybe you can, but we can definitely find it if this particular, I guess, Caitlin, you want to email us, we can hunt down that paper. There has been a little more work done on the type of compensation and how that affects attitudes.
Yeah, I agree. We'll have to dig into that one. The next question, are there special attitude factors that have been identified for proposed or existing project areas in proximity to lakefront or mountain areas with high concentrations of vacation homes?
Yep, that's a great question. I'm just going to move back to this slide if anybody needs it. So this sort of has a few different questions in it. It could be that vacation homes is something that we would be focusing on, and that is something we did look at in terms of the primary and secondary residents. We tried to look whether attitudes were different there. We found that there wasn't a statistical difference for those different home types. And then this question of topography, lake, nearby lakes and things like that. That's a really great question. We haven't characterized the viewscape around each of the respondents and each of the wind facilities. That was just way beyond what we could do. I did mention early on that we would want to look at landform, and maybe we can do that. Will give you some insights into that kind of thing. How the individual land use is around each facility is not something that we were able to bring into the model.
Good. There should be a couple easy ones coming up. Were there separate questions regarding hearing the turbines in general versus hearing them from one's own property?
Yes. So we asked individuals if they've ever heard the sound of the wind project, and then we asked them, can you hear the wind project from anywhere on your property? And then we asked them, can you hear the turbine sounds from inside your home with the windows open? And then we asked them, if you can do that, can you hear them from inside your home with the windows closed? So we have all those data. So they're in the data set. We haven't analyzed them for today's presentation. But again, if you email us about it, we can give you some quick stats on some of those if you're curious.
Yeah, and possibly will be presented in a little more detail in the third webinar with RSG, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, next question. Were there any wind projects in the south as a part of this study. So Ben, maybe you can zoom quickly back up to that map if that's still available. But I'll just answer quickly that at least at the time that we collected these data, there really were not many wind facilities installed in the southeast. Now, of course, there's at least one large one in North Carolina, but that was installed later. Looks like we did sample around Tennessee, but that would be the only one.
Yeah.
Ben, anything to add there?
Nope, that's a great answer.
Yeah, there just are not a lot of wind projects, so unfortunately. Okay, can you elaborate on why the distance of 5 miles was chosen? It seems pretty far to consider someone a neighbor.
Yeah, it's a great point. You know, one can think if one agrees with you, and I think there's reason to agree with you, then they serve as a pretty good counterfactual, right? So let's look at the attitudes of those that are so far away they really aren't interacting with the wind facility versus those that are quite close, that are otherwise in a similar kind of area that are interacting with that wind facility. So that's one reason why you can conclude people out to 5 miles. But that notwithstanding, we know that people can see turbines from pretty far away. And remember, we're 3 to 5 miles, so people can see turbines from that distance. And we know that people can be that distance and interact with the facility in some other way. So maybe they just drive by it all the time and they are bothered by it even though they live further away. We allowed people to answer some of the questions based not necessarily on exactly where their home is, but their overall attitudes toward the project. So these are people that are in the neighborhood. We did find that some of the individuals in our sample said they could see the turbines. We had a few individuals that were quite annoyed by the turbines even though they were pretty far away. So we know that some individuals that even though they're not quite close, have a very potent relationship with the local project. And so it seems reasonable to include them. I'm not sure whether 3.5 versus 5.5 or 7 or 2 is the right number, but obviously we wanted to make sure we got a broad sample. Okay.
So the next question is, which propagation model did you use for noise modeling? And that, of course, we'll go into a lot more detail in the third webinar that addresses sound specifically with RSG. But Ben, do you know that offhand?
I don't, and I know I have it in a slide. If Miguel, if you want to email me, I can tell you exactly what model. I have notes on exactly what it is, but I don't know. Be interesting to know, but yeah, it's webinar 3. You'll know all you need to know about that one.
Okay. What other type of site-specific or regional social science studies would help in adding to this understanding? Also, have you looked at rich citing literature for other energy plants and community responses?
Those are tough questions. So obviously one of the interesting things about doing a broad national study is to take that study and compare it with some of the questions that were being asked. Are regions different? Are specific kinds of projects really different than what we find across a broad set of responses? So I think what is the usefulness of this work to have this broad-based study is, for instance, a Michigan-based study was talked about earlier. In another presentation we gave, that would be really great to compare and contrast those two to see if we can learn from them. I think that what we really need to do is understand kind of what aspects from this research that pop out, and we've talked about some of them, really can help the community and developer work harmoniously together in this planning process. And so the kinds of studies that focus on applying our work or others' work to an actual development process would, I think, be particularly fruitful. Bonnie, I know I didn't give it enough. We'll have to talk offline about more areas that we could suggest for further research.
Yeah, great. This next question, maybe this is a good one to end on, Ben, unless you're on a roll. But do you foresee? Yeah. Do you foresee this research leading to best practices for wind development and community engagement?
We're not sure. I mean, we're researchers, so we can't tell you what the wind development and communities will ultimately do with this work. We hope that it provides them good information to develop those kinds of things. But I will say that we were asked to do a panel at the WIA siting conference, and we were involved in some work last year as well with the industry. And I think both of those are indications that this is something that the industry, the wind industry writ large, is interested in and wants to try to do the best they can in some of these areas. And so they're quite interested in what results we found and how that might change maybe the way that they operate. In terms of community members, that's an area that we'd love to see more interaction with. In terms of how what kind of practices are put together and what can be drawn out of our research. But it's really up to these individuals themselves to take our research and develop those. And we hope that we encourage that, but we can't say we will or will not. So we didn't get to the bottom of the barrel, did we? I can recognize some names on the list. Please feel free to email us. Let me go quickly back to the links here. And Joe and I would be glad to answer your questions separately. I guess as well we'll try to answer these via email. I guess we'll have everybody's email stored. But thanks everyone for sticking around and asking lots of questions. We'll let you go now. We'll end this webinar recording and look forward to talking to you more about this important subject in the future in any way we can.